That's exactly what I said.
Until October 5th?
Until October 25th, 2-5. Okay?
You phased out there. October 25th?
25th.
Yeah, but September or October?
October 25th.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, after today. So here we are. All right, we're in the middle of a discussion about the problems that come up when we have a Jewish leap year, and there are 2 months that are called Adar. There's the first Adar, Adar Rishon, and the second Adar, Adar Sheni. So that they didn't decide to give it a new name. They gave it the same name, Adar. And then the problem becomes, so which Adar is the real Adar? Will the real Adar please stand up? And we go back and forth here with whether it's the first Adar or the second Adar, and it's complicated as well by the realia of the time, where deciding whether there would be a second Adar could have been a last-minute decision. Now there's no such thing. Now we have it all calculated, and it's all programmed for hundreds and hundreds of years ahead of time. But in those days, the decision was made ad hoc. The decision was made by looking around and seeing how the harvest was doing, how the crops were doing, and seeing all kinds of things like that. So it was done on the spot, and then the decision could happen in the middle of the month of Adar, with only a couple of weeks left to the end of the year. Remember, Nisan is the beginning of a new Jewish year, and it could be really, literally at the last moment that the court would decide to extend the year 1 more month. Like the way Congress now has to do their budget extensions. We better, we haven't figured this out, and we have to now give ourselves a little extension. So the court would make a decision whenever it got around to it, if it had to extend the year by another month. And if this happened while the month of Adar had already been taking place, then we have the thing, well, what if we already observed Purim? Purim is on the 14th day of Adar. So what happens if they don't make the decision until the 17th? So do we do a do-over on the Megillah reading? Do we not? What does it count already? All of these questions come up. So our Mishnah says a particular kind of distinction, right? It says if they read the Megillah, this is on 6b2. I'm just reviewing things here. If they read the Megillah on the first Adar, and then the extra month of Adar, the second Adar was added, they must read it again in the second Adar. So it turns out from our Mishnah that reading the Megillah in the first Adar doesn't count. Even though it was done, with all good intentions, it made sense to read it at that time. But then, if subsequently the decision was, no, we need a second Adar, we have to go back and read the Megillah again. And then we have the rule, there's no difference between the first Adar and the second Adar, except with regard to reading the Megillah and giving gifts to the poor. So this general principle is ambiguous. On the first hand, we get the first part of the Mishnah tells us a concrete rule. You must read the Megillah again. But now we have a general rule. The general rule is there's no difference between first Adar and second Adar except reading Megillah, and now they add an extra piece and giving gifts to the poor on Purim. Well, what about the other stuff? What about all the other things that are part? What if you do all the other things in the first Adar? What if you, and then this is where the Gemara brings up, there are other things that happen in preparation for Nisan, like reading 4 different extra Torah readings. In addition to the regular Shabbat Torah reading, there were 4 extra readings that had to be read. What if you thought that you were getting close to the month of Nisan, so you were reading the Torah readings that had to be read to prepare for Nisan, and then all of a sudden, no need to prepare for Nisan, we've got an extra month now. So do we have to read the Torah readings again? What if you had your Purim meal? Do you have to do that? What if you sent shalach manos to people? in the first Purim. Do you have to do that again?
Yeah.
So the Mishnah seems to open up this idea that there are certain things that you have to do again, but certain other things you don't. Then we got to 6b3. And in 6b3, we had a more extensive Braita, right? A set of teachings where we have certain named sages who have opinions about this question. And then the Gemara says, wait a second, do these opinions line up with our Mishnah? Does our Mishnah reflect the viewpoint of one of these people that are mentioned in the Braita, or do we have a multiplicity of views that don't line up at all, and we have a whole controversy here with a lot of different opinions? What gives here? That's where we're in the middle of now. We're in the middle of trying to sort out whether the opinions that are delineated in the Braita, do any of them line up with the Mishnah, or is it separate? Are they all separate? And then we have a subsidiary question, and that is, let's make sense of the Braita itself. Do we actually understand what the positions are that are mentioned in the Braita? Because the wording there is also going to be a little bit ambiguous. So I think for clarity's sake for us, it would pay actually, even though we read this already, to start at 6b3 from the top of the page, from the very top of the page, based on this inference. Okay, so how about we start there? Okay, now who will do us the honor of reading, please? Beryl, you raise your hand so quickly. So good reflexes.
Now, let's see if I can unmute as fast as I can raise my hand.
Right, that's the test. Yeah.
Based on this inference, the Gemara notes that our Mishnah is at variance with the opinions of three Tananim recorded in the Baraita.
Tanaim.
Tanaim,
Good.
who is the author of our Mishnah. It is neither the Tanakama of the following Baraita, nor Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, nor Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel.
So stop for 1 second, please. Tanakama, I've already explained it. I'll explain again. Tanakama means first teacher. The first teacher, because the first teacher is anonymous. In the Braita that we're about to read, there is no name given to this opinion. So therefore, that he's called in the technical term a Tanakama, the first teacher. And then we have two sages named who are given their say about what their opinion is. Okay, let's read the Braita.
For it was taught in a Baraita, if they had read the Megillah in the first Adar, and subsequently an extra month of Adar was added to the year, they must read the Megillah again in the second Adar, because all the mitzvot that apply in the second Adar can apply in the first Adar as well, except for reading the Megillah. Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi,
Oh,
said,
hold on, one second. So let's just note for a second that there's a similarity in language between this Braita and our Mishnah. The Mishnah is on 6b2, and then there's some slight differences also. Okay, so it has the same scenario. What happens if they observe Purim in Adar, just like they're supposed to, and then poof, all of a sudden they decided to add another month? So they said the answer, what do you do now? The answer is, according to this language, and here the language is slightly different than the Mishnah's language, everything, all the mitzvahs that apply in the second Adar can apply in the first Adar, meaning, okay, if you did it in the first Adar, good enough, except for reading the Megillah.
Oh.
Megillah has to happen in the second Adar. If you did it in the first Adar, you don't get credit. You have to do it again in the second Adar. So that's close to our Mishnah, but we're going to see later on it's not 100%. Okay, go.
they do not have to read the Megillah again in the second Adar, because all the mitzvot that apply in the second Adar apply in the first Adar.
Stop for a second. So now we have the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, and he disagrees with this exception. He says, no, you, Tanakama, first teacher, you said all mitzvot that apply in the second Adar can apply in the first Adar. And you say, except Megillah? No, drop out the exception. It's a general rule. Anything that you can do, I can do better. Right? In the first Adar, it's good enough. So as far as the Rabbi Yossi is, Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, is concerned, no, if you did it in the first Adar, that's perfect. Okay, you don't have to redo it. Now, it still leaves the question, what happens if they actually didn't do it yet and they find out there's a second Adar? Do they do it in the first Adar or not? That's a question that's hanging. Go ahead.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, in the name of Rav Yossi, they must even read it, again, in the second Adar, because all the mitzvot that apply in the second Adar do not apply in the first Adar.
Okay, so now he's taking that same phrase that we had before, but he makes it negative. No, the first Adar never counts. Okay, so that sounds like a much more blanket rejection. And it sounds like there's a whole bunch of stuff that couldn't count, but we're not sure yet. Now, and all these Tanaim, go ahead,
agree in regard to eulogizing and fasting that they are prohibited on both this month, the first Adar, and the other month, the second Adar.
Okay, so the idea that on Purim itself, we're not talking about the whole month, but on Purim itself, the 14th, possibly the 15th, we are supposed to be rejoicing. We're supposed to be happy. So we're not going to engage in any fasting, public fasting and mourning and public eulogizing. That idea says the Braita, everybody agrees that you extend that to the first Adar as well as the second Adar. Okay, so those are the three opinions. And our initial statement was none of these opinions they're close, but none of these opinions seems to be identical with the Mishnah's opinion. But now let's further explain how we divide up these opinions. Okay, before explaining
why the ruling of our Mishnah does not conform with any of the opinions in the Baraita, the Gemara first seeks to clarify the Baraita. The opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is the same as the opinion of the Tanakama.
Right, or a better English would be, isn't the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the same as the Tanakama? The Gemara is saying, wait a second, we don't see a big difference between what the Tanakama said, the first teacher, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. It sounds like they really agree. Why is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel cited as a separate authority if he simply agrees with the first teaching? Go ahead. But remember, the Megillah has to be read again in the second Adar, that it doesn't count. You get no credit for reading Megillah the first Adar.
The Gemara answers, Rav Papa said, there is disagreement between them over the series of 4 portions, for the Tanakama holds that properly the 4 portions should be read in the second Adar. But if they are read in the first Adar, that is sufficient. The exception is reading the Megillah, in which case the rule is that even if they had read the Megillah in the first Adar, they must read it again in the second Adar.
That makes sense.
And Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, holds that even the reading of the Megillah should be performed in the first Adar. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that even in the regard to the series of 4 portions, if they had read the 4 portions in the first Adar, they must read them again in the second Adar.
Okay. So in other words, what happens now is Rav Papa says the context is shifted. Let's shift the context a little bit, and then we can understand how there are differences between all three opinions. Let's shift the context away from reading the Megillah. Let's make the context into readings in general, the public readings of the Torah and the Megillah. If we talk about that, then we get a distinction. The Tana Kama, the first Tana, the first teacher, says there are all kinds of public Torah readings that we need to do in preparation for Nisan, which happen in Adar. If they happen in the first month, so what can I do? Let them count anyway. Even though that we should always put it into the second Adar if we know ahead of time. But if we don't know ahead of time and you did it already, I'm not going to make you do it again. I'll give you credit for it, except for Megillah. That's the one reading that I won't give you credit for. Then you have Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, who says, no, if we're giving credit for the other Torah readings, they're Torah readings after all, then we'll give credit for the Megillah too. If you did it in the first month, good enough. And then Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, I'm an extremist. I'm totally rejecting all of the legitimacies of the readings in the first month. None of those readings count, and everything has to be done in the second Adar. Okay, you have to do it all. Do over. So those are now, we understand a little bit better, more clearly, that there are three opinions. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, is the most lenient. The Tana Kama compromises, or he has a middle position, and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the most strict. Yeah, Josie.
I think I'm going to go with Ben Gamliel because otherwise,
How much? $5, $10? What do you want to put on him?
what is the point of the second Adar? It'll have no real importance if we don't read the Megillah and do the mitzvot, and it's just a fake month, a fake name.
So that's a good way of bringing up the question. What is going on here with these 2 months? Yeah. Which is the real month? Which is the fake month? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve by having this extra month? And is there a meaning to having the extra month? If, like you say, if they did all of these celebrations and ceremonies and rituals in the first month, so what's left for the second month? What's the point of it? Okay, good question. Yeah, Sylvia.
Okay, so I went back to the Mishnah, which is sort of clear. And it says if they'd read the Megillah in the first Adar, they must read it again in the second Adar. And then it goes on, the rule, there's no difference between the first and second Adar except as to the reading of the Megillah. Why is there so much discussion if it's so clear from the Mishnah?
I think you came in a little bit late.
I'm sorry.
And the idea is, and this you're familiar with this from your studies of Talmud, just because the Mishnah says something doesn't mean everybody agreed with what's in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a record that is a partial record of the discussions that happened in its time. The Baraita, which means a record of discussion that doesn't make it into the Mishnah, nevertheless is contemporaneous with the Mishnah, and it reports that actually plenty of people disagreed with the Mishnah. So even though the editor of the Mishnah decided to only include one particular point of view, that doesn't mean that that point of view reflects the consensus.
And how is contemporary, how and a contemporary reading of the Talmud deals with that? How?
What I don't
know. Today, I'm saying today.
We accept that they were floating around in an oral culture, many different teachings,
right?
And some of them were collected in one kind of collection, and others were collected in other collections.
So it's another way of opening up everything for practice.
It's a fact of life. This is not about a conceptual idea. This is the Talmud, and everybody else is recognizing that we have all kinds of centers and salons where these things are being discussed, and there is no unanimity. It's not like we have a global Zoom session where everybody is privy to everybody else's opinion at the same time, number one. And number two, the Mishnah was a concerted effort to create a record that was acknowledged to be selective. And
Correct.
all of the other records were kept alive and were
Okay.
preserved, but they didn't quite have the same imprimatur as the Mishnah. But nevertheless, when it gets studied and explored, sometimes the Mishnah will end up being reinterpreted or even pushed aside in favor of a different parallel tradition.
Well, not too dissimilar, I guess, from our Constitution, and that we have all the records of the Constitutional Convention, and there are people who, and Stuart, you can certainly expound on this much better than I. There are positions that were taken that are referred to today that are not that are somewhat different from the generally accepted traditions.
Right. Okay. So I'm not a big American legal scholar. I'm not even a little American legal scholar. But to me, the big distinction is that the Constitution, in the end, is the law of the land.
This
The
is not, you're saying.
The Mishnah is not the law of the land. The Mishnah is
Okay.
an official guidebook that collects opinions and rules and regulations, but is not necessarily the law of the land. It was never adopted as the Constitution. Yeah, Stuart.
Well, I want to respond to the substantive question that Josie raised.
Yeah.
Rather than the sort of legislative intent question. So Josie made an argument which, so there's two different paradigms here. One is that Adar 2 is just a placeholder. It's just there as a corrective to the lack of coordination between the sun and the moon, and we need, if we want to have Rosh Hashanah in autumn when it's supposed to be, then we need to have that extra month to make up the time. And from that point of view, it's just a housekeeping matter, and Adar is just a placeholder. It's just there to keep things running straight. I think what Josie was saying, maybe I'm elaborating on what Josie said, is look, if Adar has any meaning, we still have to live Adar 2 in a way that is holy, and it shouldn't just be an empty number of days that we're counting until we get back to the beginning of the year again. So we need to give it meaning, and one way to do that is to observe all the usual things that we do during the regular non-leap year Adar. And I think both of those are attractive ideas. There's something about the idea of just, okay, we're not going to do anything during the second Adar because, that's just empty time. We're just trying to make it up. On the other hand, it seems a little excessive that we're doing all these things for a second time. It's a little bit the way I feel being a Reformed Jew about the second day of Rosh Hashanah and the second Seder, but that's a discussion for another day.
Or the second day of the week.
What's that?
Or the second day of the week. I mean, we did everything the first day.
So it seems like there's a compromise that some of the things we do during what do you call it? The second Adar. We don't call it. I mean, we didn't have to call it the second Adar. We could have called it empty time, or we could have called it, made up in a different name. But we do call it the second Adar, which suggests that it has some Adarness about it.
Right. I think that both of you are bringing up the all of these different kinds of aspects of the problem. Let me just again bring home what I sort of said before, but a little sharper. Let's say that the decision to have a second Adar is adopted 3 months before the end of the year, which could happen also. This decision could happen in different times. It could be, like I said, it's really a judgment call by the court, and they may be seeing things, 2 months ahead, that make them say, okay, forget it. We're really so early on in this season. We're never going, and it's not so much that the Rosh Hashanah should be in the fall, it's that Passover should be in the spring.
Right.
So that's the immediate concern.
Right.
So they may see, look, we are so still stuck in winter. We need, the dry season. I mean, the wet season, because Pesach is already when there's a dry season in Israel, but it's the spring. When we're going to need to add a month. So if that decision is made in enough time, then we have 2 Adars, and everybody agrees that all of the rituals that apply to Adar happen in the 2nd Adar and not the 1st Adar. Everybody agrees that the 1st Adar is a placeholder.
Right.
Everybody agrees. It's a little counterintuitive. You would think the 1st Adar is the real Adar, and then we just added another 30-day extension like we do for the budget.
Right.
But it actually, conceptually, is understood. And we're going to see more of this played out next month when we get back to the later discussions in the Talmud. But for now, we should just understand and accept that the 2nd Adar is considered the Adar where everything should happen.
Could you just repeat again why that's the case? Because it is counterintuitive.
Well, you're going to get to it in the Talmud.
Okay.
So, but just right now, you have to accept that.
Okay.
So that means that Adar 1 is really just biding our time.
Right.
It's stretching out the time. It's like a little bit like when we see that at the end of Yom Kippur, we davened a little too quick, and we're not ready yet to finish the davening because we still have another 20 minutes before Yom Kippur is over. So we start slowing down, and we sing things, 10 times instead of only 5 times. So you gotta stretch it out a little bit. So the 1st Adar is stretching it out. That's the way it should work. Correct. David puts a note. Adar 2 is more related to Nisan than Adar 1. It's closer to Nisan. That's part of what we'll get into the discussion. Now, the problem that where this stuff gets highlighted is when we didn't know there was going to be a 2nd Adar, and we went around our usual business in the 1st Adar. And that brings up what Stuart is saying. Well, so what are we supposed to do? So if the 2nd Adar now came in, and are we supposed to just redo everything that we did already? If we did everything, do we have to do it again and again and again? So, or do we adopt the 2nd Adar as the placeholder month, which has some significance in that it's going to make it possible for Nisan and for Passover to happen at the biblically mandated time. So it's fulfilling some kind of role. It has some kind of, but in terms of the rituals, do we give credit to the rituals that were done in good faith? Right? We're not mandating in general that everybody, when we know ahead of time, we know 3 months ahead of time that there's going to be 2 Adars. We don't tell everybody you have to do Purim twice. We're not telling everybody, no, well, we have to do this Adar and Adar. No, just do it the right time. But now the problem was we got ourselves in trouble because we didn't know. We weren't prepared. And so now the question is, so how much are we going to insist on that 2nd Adar taking primary place as Adar? Now, it seems one way to read Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, is what the heck, they did it all in the 1st Adar, leave them alone. Another way to read it is maybe he actually disagrees with this whole thing and says, no, my intuition says the 1st Adar counts as the real Adar. So therefore, everything that's done in the 1st Adar should be done in the 1st Adar. And don't worry about the 2nd Adar. The 2nd Adar is just taking a couple of slow, deep breaths to wait for Nisan to come out in the right time. Right? So maybe he actually completely rejects the idea that the 2nd Adar is the real, quote unquote, the real Adar. Right? So these are all mushy questions that we're still trying to sort out. Is it a definitional question about which Adar counts? Is it a practical question of, well, how much do you want to make people do the same thing over and over and over again? These are some of the issues. Okay, so now we're going back to the idea of let's lay out Where is our Mishnah vis-a-vis the Braita? So we're at 6b3, the right-hand column. The Gemara now demonstrates.
The Gemara now demonstrates that our Mishnah does not conform, excuse me, with any of the opinions recorded in the Baraita. Who is the author of our Mishnah? If you suggest it is the Tanakama of the Baraita, then a difficulty arises in respect to gifts for the poor. Our Mishnah, which holds that the mitzvah of gifts for the poor applies only in the second Adar, could not have been authored by the Tanakama, who implies that this mitzvah can be fulfilled in the first Adar.
Right. Our Mishnah says explicitly that gifts for the poor have to be done in the second Adar and don't count if they were done in the first Adar. And the Tanakama in our Braita, the first teacher, only singles out reading Megillah. He doesn't mention gifts of the poor. So he apparently doesn't care if the gifts of the poor were given in the first Adar in good faith, because that's when they thought Purim was. He's not making us repeat it. You gave the gifts of the poor, good enough. Let's go on, right? So this opinion doesn't quite jive with the Mishnah. Next.
If you suggest it is Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, then a difficulty arises also in respect to reading the Megillah. Unlike our Mishnah, which rules that the Megillah reading applies in the second Adar, Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, holds that it applies in the first Adar.
Right? Clear disagreement. So he can't be the Mishnah's author.
If you suggest it is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, then a difficulty arises in respect to the series of 4 portions. Our Mishnah implies that the 4 portions need not be repeated in the second Adar, whereas Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that this mitzvah can be fulfilled only in the second Adar.
Right. So our Mishnah singles out only 2 mitzvot, only gifts to the poor and Megillah, that have to be put into the second Adar no matter what. Even if you did it before, you got to put it into the second Adar. But Rabban Shimon Gamliel says everything has to be put in the second Adar. Any observances that you put in the first Adar don't count. That includes reading the Torah in the 4 Torah readings that we do in preparation for Nisan and for Passover. If you did it in the first Adar, which you should, if there's only 1 Adar, you're doing it in Adar, you're doing it right. But now there's a second Adar. For Rabban Shimon Gamliel, none of it counts. According to the Mishnah, it does count. So therefore, each of these opinions doesn't seem to quite line up with the Mishnah. So now the Gemara says.
The Gemara answers, really? The author of our Mishnah is the Tanakama.
Okay, so now I want to just stop for a half a second before we see how the Gemara does that. Coming back to Sylvia's question, what the Gemara is trying to do now is minimize controversy and say we have the Mishnah, which is first among equals, right? Whatever I said before, the Mishnah is not the Constitution for sure, but still it is the Mishnah. It is the choice product of the rabbinic distilled wisdom, and it was given, first standing, as opposed to all these other outside traditions. So we should try to make it line up with somebody where we have a record of a bunch of other people giving their opinions. Instead of making 4 opinions, let's see if we can line up one of these with the Mishnah. And conveniently, we have an unnamed authority in the Braita, the first teacher. So maybe that unnamed anonymous is the same as the author of our Mishnah. Let's see how.
The Tanakama taught the case of reading the Megillah, but the same ruling applies in the case of gifts for the poor, for one is dependent upon the other. Thus, in actuality, the Tanakama agrees with the ruling of our Mishnah that the mitzvah of gifts for the poor can be fulfilled only in the second Adar.
Okay, in other words, what the Gemara is saying is don't be so strict in reading what the Tanna Kama says. He means to require gifts of the poor in the second Adar, but that he doesn't mention it because he takes it for granted. Once he says Megillah, he thinks that you understand that he's talking about also gifts to the poor as being required. Once he requires that the Megillah has to be reread in the second Adar, then you should understand automatically that he also requires that the gifts of the poor should be done when the reading of the Megillah is done again, because we know that that's exactly how the poor know that they should expect to get gifts, right? They look and see when Megillah reading is, and they go, oh, they're reading Megillah. That means we're about to get gifts. So we had this discussion earlier, a few pages back, and we said, that you have to be careful. You have to watch out for their feelings. They have expectations. They're looking forward, so you can't postpone it and not do it when you're supposed to. So when we had all like, which day should you do it and so on. So the Gemara was very sensitive to the fact that the poor people key their expectations. Oh, I'm going to get that extra bonus. I'm going to get that extra gift when they start reading the Megillah. So they know that the reading of the Megillah and getting the gifts of the poor are linked together. So therefore the Tanna Kama, when he says Megillah, he assumes that you understand that he's also requiring that gifts to the poor should also be given. Okay, and therefore he lines up completely with the Mishnah. So that's our first answer. Now we're on an alternative, 6b4.
Okay, that's a first. Usually I turn the page and then there's a note on the previous page that you want me to read. An alternative answer. And if you prefer, say that really the author of our Mishnah is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. There is no disparity between their rulings because it is as if our Mishnah is missing words, and in reality, this is what it teaches. There is no difference between the 14th of the first Adar and the 14th of the second Adar, except in regard to reading the Megillah and gifts for the poor, but in regard to eulogies and fasting, both this date, the 14th of the first Adar, and the other date, the 14th of the second Adar, are the same. That is, eulogizing and fasting are prohibited on both dates. However, the Mishnah does not refer to the series of 4 portions at all. Thus, our Mishnah is not in conflict with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that the obligation to read the 4 portions applies only in the second Adar.
Okay, so what the Gemara now says is, let's reread the ruling, the general rule in our Mishnah vis-a-vis the Braita. So if you go back to 6b2, we have the Mishnah proclaims the following rule. You got it? See, you didn't get it. You didn't escape the idea that you had to turn back all the way to 6b2. Okay, the Mishnah proclaims the following rule. The last 3 lines of the Mishnah. You got it? Before the Gemara.
Wait, not yet. What's the first word I'm looking for?
The Mishnah proclaims the following rule. It's in the indented part where it says Mishnah.
Mishnah. In a leap year?
No, go down a little bit more. Finish the first paragraph. Then it says,
The Mishnah proclaims the following rule. There is no difference between the first Adar and the second Adar, except in respect to reading the Megillah and gifts for the poor.
Now we go back to 6b4. And you go down 2, 4, 6, 7 lines from the top.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is no difference between the 14th of the first Adar and the 14th of the second Adar, except in regard to reading the Megillah and gifts for the poor.
What's the difference between this version and the version we had on 6b2?
There's a difference.
There is a
It's moving
difference,
to the
a
14th.
little difference.
It
Still,
adds the date.
yes, exactly. She beat you to it. So yes, in the Mishnah, as we have it, the text of the Mishnah says there's no difference between the first Adar and the second Adar except A and B. Right? Now the Gemara says, but actually they're not talking about the whole month of Adar. They're only talking about one day in Adar. They're talking about Purim in the month of Adar. They're not talking about the whole month of Adar. So they're only talking about the 14th when we have Purim in Adar. That's why it says that the only difference is Megillah and gifts to the poor, because those apply on the 14th of Adar. But all those Torah readings that we were talking about, they don't happen on Purim. They happen on the Shabbos that happens at the beginning of Adar and then the next month and so on and so forth. So those Torah readings are part of the general schedule of Adar, but not about the Purim day of Adar. So let's just understand that even though it says Adar, what they're really talking about, the context, right? From the beginning of the Mishnah where it says, oh, they read the Megillah, and then they found out that there's another Adar. What should they do? The answer is they should read that the Megillah again, because there's no difference between the first Adar and the second Adar except reading the Megillah, etc. So what the Gemara is saying is they're really only talking about Purim in the Mishnah. They're not talking about the whole month. Therefore, we can say that the opinion of our Mishnah and the opinion of Rabbi ben Gamliel with regard to everything else also lines up. That the Mishnah does not mean to exclude that the four Torah readings don't have to be reread. Yes, it does have to be reread. That's Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's position. So it turns out that we can make the Mishnah jibe either with the Tanna Kama, or if we read it a certain other way, we can make it work with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. What in order to harmonize the one way or the other, what do we have to do? Either we have to loosen up our reading of the opinion mentioned in the Braita. That's what we do in the first suggestion. Let's understand that the Tanna Kama doesn't really mean to be read so closely. We can generalize a little bit more. He meant to include more, right? That's our first reading. So don't be so strict in reading his opinion. The second way, where we harmonize it with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, we go the opposite way. We say, don't be so strict in reading what the Mishnah says, right? The Mishnah is only talking about a particular context. So each of these solutions recognizes that we have formulations that were passed down, but those formulations need to be read with a little bit of extra understanding. We can't simply just take the words and only those words. We have to say, no, those words exist within a broader flow of discussion. And therefore, even though the shorthand that the words represents sounds like it's only talking about A, it actually could be talking about A and B, right? And that's basically what's happening here in both cases. And the solution, of course, is that we have basically three opinions in the Braita. The Mishnah could go either according to opinion A or according to opinion C. Definitely, Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, totally disagrees with our Mishnah. And now the question is, what do we do? So the Gemara cites a legal decision.
Rav Haya bar Avin said in the name of Rav Yochanan, the law is in accordance with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who said in the name of Rav Yossi that the reading of the Megillah and the four portions must be performed in the second Adar.
Okay, so now we have an relatively unusual phenomenon. It's not unheard of, but it doesn't happen most of the time, where the Gemara gives us a final decision. And the final decision here is, among all these different opinions, we pick Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and we don't pick for sure Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer the son of Rabbi Yossi, and therefore we take the second Adar as the Adar for the purposes of observing Purim. Right? We must observe Purim in the second Adar, not in the first Adar. Okay, so now we've established a clear dichotomy. The Tanakama is a little murky because if we line up the Tanakama with the Mishnah, if we line up, the Gemara says we might even be able to line up the Tanakama with Rabban Shimon Gamliel. It's a little murky what's going on with the Tanakama, but we definitely now understand Rabban Shimon Gamliel, and we definitely understand that Rabban Shimon Gamliel disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi. So now the Gemara goes to the next step. And the Gemara says, where do they get these opinions from? Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi seems to privilege the first Adar. Rabban Shimon Gamliel privileges the second Adar. How do they come up with these opinions? Why does one choose the first Adar as the real, so to speak, real Adar, and the other one chooses the second Adar as the real Adar? Right? The questions that we brought up before. Okay, the Gemara.
The Gemara gives the scriptural sources for the views of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi. Rav Yochanan said both Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, derived their opinions from the same verse. Scripture states, in each and every year, Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, holds.
So hold on one second. Thank you. Sorry. So first of all, number one, we've seen this many times. Their opinion is hooked onto a verse. I read a verse a certain way, and to make sense of that verse, I derive a certain opinion. It's not just I'm making up the opinion out of thin air. It's not arbitrary. It comes out of reading scripture. It comes out of reading the Torah. Here, I'm not the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but the Torah, the whole expansive Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible. So now, it says Rabbi Yochanan, they both are reading the identical verse, and yet they come to different conclusions. So it's not like if you read a verse, okay, that proves it once and for all. We haven't solved the problem. We end up coming back to the idea that actually 2 people can disagree completely based on the same verse. They read the same verse and they come to opposite conclusions. What's the verse? So the verse, we only have a little piece of it quoted in our Gemara text. Look at, please, at note 41.
Esther, the verse in its entirety reads.
Right, so Esther 9:21, Esther chapter 9, verse 21.
Charging them that they should observe the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th of the same in each and every year.
Right, so we only have in our Gemara, the quote is the last few words of that verse. Right, but the whole verse says that with Esther's urging, we have now the commandment to observe Purim, the 14th day of Adar, every year, right? Each and every year, right? Not just a one-time celebration, but each and every year to make it into a real holiday. Okay. Back to the Gemara.
Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Yossi, holds that this phrase, in each and every year, teaches the following. Just as each and every year, Purim is observed in Adar, which is the month closest to the month of Shevat, so here too, when there are 2 months of Adar, Purim is observed in the Adar, which is closest to the month of Shevat.
Okay, so that's Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi's opinion. He says, what this says is, we've got a year that's consisting of 12 months, right? And as people have already noticed, when we add another Adar, do we make a new name for the month? No, we don't make 13 different names of months. We've got a 12-month year, right? And how do you go along with the year? You go Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shvat, Adar. That's the way the year goes. So Adar comes right after Shvat. It's our month that comes along in the chain of months, and it comes right after. That's the year in and year out. That's what it's all about. And then guess what? Then when we needed to make Adar extra long, we added a little extra, few days. The way we added another day in February, right? When we make February, it's the same month, and we added a little extra at the end. So instead of adding 1 day for a leap year, we added another 29 days for a leap year. But it's all Adar. So the first chunk of Adar is the authentic Adar. It's the one that continues with the flow of the year. So Shvat is the 11th month, and then Adar is the next month, and that's when we should have everything happening. And then all the rest is extra extensions. Yes, Geraldine.
I don't know if this is the right time to ask this, so if it's for later, let me know. My uncle died Rosh Chodesh Adar 2. So what do you do about that?
Right. So
Always observe when it's not a leap year on Rosh Chodesh Adar 1, but what do you do when there are 2 Adars?
Right. So this is a whole headache with when it comes to yard sites. Let's wait for that till after we get the basic layout of the discussion. Okay. So
Yes.
you have to be patient, and frankly, you're going to have to wait a month because
Okay.
I already announced this is our last session until October 25th. Okay.
Well, I don't have to worry about it until Adar.
Right. So that's correct. So
That
not only that, but I have to end a little early today because I have to go and officiate at the Legman wedding. So in Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's
I have to leave. Yes.
Just
So
a quick question.
yes.
Does it ever come up that perhaps there should be a different way of setting up the calendar?
I was going to ask something.
What do you mean a different way?
Well, more similar to what we do, where we correct it more frequently, so you only have to add a day every once in a while.
So the problem of the correction, you'll never be able to correct it by adding a day. The
But
problem,
we do it every 4 years.
right? But the problem is, what are you correcting for? I mean, we had this discussion of a couple of sessions back. When you're correcting the secular year, you're taking a solar year and you're adjusting because the mathematics of a solar year don't reduce to a clean number of days. There's always a little extra. There's always a few more hours. So every once in a while, you just have to keep fixing it. So every 4 years, you add a day. So that's easy enough. The problem is that the Jewish calendar is totally different. It's a lunar calendar being adjusted to a solar calendar.
Yeah.
That's the thing. A lunar calendar by itself is fine. The Muslims have a lunar calendar and they don't
Out of
adjust it.
control.
They just use it and it works. It works fine. It works extra, terrific. But our problem is that the Torah says that Passover must happen in the spring season. Seasons are solar; they're not lunar.
No, I realize.
So we have a lunar calendar that has to keep on getting adjusted to the solar calendar. That every year, the difference is not 1 day, the difference is 11 days and change. So you can't just add a day. You add a day every year, you'll still fall back. So that's why you need to do these periodic addings of a month.
But if they were so aware of the solar calendar driving it, no discussion at some point to move to a solar calendar.
There was a tremendous fight in the Jewish community about whether there should be a solar calendar or a lunar calendar only, or a mix of the two together. This was a big controversy early on. And it's a big controversy among scholars how serious each community was. Was it only theoretical? Was it actually practical? When we see the stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls community, it looks like, and I'm saying this very cautiously, it looks like the Dead Sea Scrolls community, which is just before the rabbinic community comes in, It looks like they used a solar calendar, not a lunar calendar. But the lunar calendar existed, since ancient times. And it's probable that there were certain groups that advocated a solar calendar and certain groups that advocated a lunar or a mix. And the one that won in the Jewish community, the approach that won is the one that we have now. But it was definitely a matter of contention for quite a while.
And perhaps not too long before this discussion is happening.
No, this is already hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the lunar calendar has been established. All right. Unfortunately, I have to go, so we'll have to get back to this discussion
In October.
In October, God willing.
Wow.
I want to wish everybody a sweet year, a good year, and we'll see each other hopefully in different contexts in celebration. Okay, take care.
Yashar Koach.
Yashar Koach. Thank you.
Yashar Koach.
Thank